Greetings, comrades, and welcome to the Eastern Border. And this morning, we're here joined on my Discord channel with a bunch of people. Well, most people who decided to join because it's nearly 8 a.m. in the morning for me, and it's very late in the United States. And I'm here joined by my good friend John Michael Godier, because if you've been following the show lately, understand that sometimes I need a breather episode, especially after all the things that have happened lately. If you actually checked on the Kalashnikov episode, you understand that this was also weird and crazy. And, well, I have also some news that I really need John to comment on. I went through and picked the ones that will cause the maximum amount of confusion to John for him to answer from a scientific perspective, but he has had a very great interview that I mentioned on the show on his Event Horizon channel. There's also going to be a big announcement soon on the show when Evit allows me to make it. But so I'm a bit busy currently. So welcome, John, and nice to have you back on the show again.
Hello, everybody. It's nice to be here again, Chris. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's a thing because for starters, I finally also have acquired a webcam, so I am confused because now I can actually see John, and John can look at the mess that is my room. Life has been clearly very interesting lately. Can you please, before we start talking about this, could you please advertise what's the biggest interview that you just recently did? Because I told about it to people, but a lot of people, I think that at least I've gotten from messages, have misunderstood because I can't really advertise your show better than you can. So please explain to people what the interview was about, because I really want them, if you're listening to the show right now, pause this, go to Event Horizon channel, spend 2 hours listening to John's interview, and then come back here. That would be very good for you. Just saying, because this is a breather episode and we're going to take things slow, but I really need to advertise the interview. So please, John, please send people to your YouTube channel.
Well, I interviewed the Pentagon's former interim director of ARROW, which is the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. In other words, they are the people that look at things like UFOs and unexplained objects that they detect, and with U.S. Navy equipment, Air Force equipment, things like that. And I did a relatively long interview with him, about 2 hours, and a very open interview. That's what that was try to get to the bottom of whatever the U.S. government knows about the subject of UFOs, or UAP is their.
That's the thing, because before the interview, we had a long conversation with John about all this stuff because it was very interesting. However, first, there are some Russian news because, it's very early for me. It's late for you. We have 8-hour time difference. So to warm up, I actually really gathered a bunch of news stuff. First news that I would like to comment come from my previous episode, which is the fact that in Russian Gosduma, they tried to introduce a law that would ban advertisements of all sorts of fortune tellers and all sorts of those things. The problem is that what really stunned me from these news is that I found out that currently in Russia, they spend more money purchasing all sorts of services of various sorcerers, fortune tellers, everything than they spend on food globally. In dollars, they spend about $36 million per year in total that I did previously on these fortune tellers, and they spend about $25 million on food. And they tried to stop advertising these things. But the Russian Gosduma deputies decided that they like fortune tellers too much, so they denied this whole fact. And now we have a law. They had to specify that not only do they consider the fact that all sorts of, people like Vanga, which also was very much a fraud person, but not only do they support the good types of these supernatural people, but due to how the law works, seriously, apparently they will not prohibit even dark wizards, literally, in law from advertising in Russia, because that would be unfair. We're literally there. So what do you know about dark wizardry, John?
Well, what I do know is that Russia has a long history of religious figures that claim to be Jesus, or they claim to be prophets, things like that. I think the Russian word is starets or something like that. Rasputin was was sort of considered one of those. That's my understanding of how Russians see wizards, but that's a cultural thing, because that might be a little bit different than how Americans see wizards, which, is things like the Lord of the Rings. So I don't know what the cultural difference in how you would interpret and imagine a wizard to be.
Well, the thing is one of the biggest channels, and well, there is a channel called TNT. Now they do mostly Russian propaganda, but they got famous by being the channel which runs only conspiracy theories, all the things we're about to talk later today. But they also ran 11 seasons of something called Bitva Extrasense, of Battle of the Extrasensory People, which was it started out actually seriously with people like magicians, stage magicians coming on and judging if they're not cheating. It started out pretty good. By season 3, it went out by the fact that they literally picked up people from the street, dressed them up, and did this for PR reasons. So that was a thing. But see, on a serious note, we're gonna talk definitely. I'm gonna ask you about the fates of Russian science, because there is a bunch of bad news there, and I know that your audience also cares about this fact because it's pretty bad for scientists there. Evita's mom is an immunologist, and she goes to conferences, and through her I also know the status of Belarusian and Russian academia. And sadly, that's a very dark topic, therefore I started out with these more happier news. But I have 5 little more things which I found, and I'll start with the fact that Russians will be jailed for 15 days for wearing swimwear outside the beach. They decided not to ban all these, fortune tellers from advertising, but they decided that it will totally destroy the country's morale if you decide to just walk from your house to the beach, or from where you're staying to the beach, wearing swimwear. And it used to be a finable offense, but right now it actually is less funny than it might sound. Or they're trying to make laws more draconic. And I really don't think that they're taking this ironically. But do you think that in the United States, how would people react there if they would understand that you can't really wear swimwear outside the beach? I think all of Southern California would just cease to exist and protests would erupt.
They'd explode. And the fact is, you can wear swimwear anywhere. It isn't even abnormal. But I mean, Europe has nude beaches.
That's a very German thing, though.
It's a very German thing, but I imagine we have them too. But we certainly have nudist colonies. The fact of the matter is that I think in 2025, somebody walking around in a bikini is not something that is particularly shocking, at least to me. Um, and if you go to the beach, what's the difference if you see somebody walk by that's walking to the beach wearing one or something like that? I don't understand what would be the right word. We would say prude in English, but a prudish, sort of policy. But I would suspect, though, a lot of times when governments enact laws like this, they're either religious or they want to collect fines.
And you get the correct answer, because this is definitely for fines, but they also are increasing them. And also because, for another reason, the people in Gosduma, they have to pretend that they still actually matter and that they do something. So someone has business interests, and what they do is constantly do useless things so that it would look nice in camera, and so that it actually seems that they do anything else besides rubber stamping a bunch of stuff. And some of the deputies there make very outrageous things that just show how they've turned into a joke. But yeah, see, the big issue is that these news are funny if you look at them from our perspective, but they become more serious if you look from there. I have like 4 more tiny little news like this, which I'm gonna go through. First of all, Russia has proposed reducing the length of schooling in schools and universities so that Russians will have children sooner. To do this, apparently, they advised to return to the 8 and 10-year school system and reduce basic and specialized higher education, according to the Chamber of Education, like the Committee of Education in Russian Gosduma. This isn't even funny, this is just sad.
Don't reduce education. That is my view on it is when you see a government reducing education time, which I personally think is if you're going to educate a kid before going to university, it needs to be 12 years, well, maybe 13, with kindergarten and things like that. And that's the standard, and reducing it just seems like dumbing your people down.
That's the thing which I'd like to actually talk about, because education and all this university stuff ties into later subjects here. Since during the Soviet era, if you were not a Russian, you studied for 12 years in school. Russians studied for 11 years. Everyone else also had a lot of subjects in Russian added in. And the second thing is that due to how Soviet Union worked, education was free in the Soviet Union. But the problem is that the spaces allocated for how many people could get in university was very limited. For example, they took in say 20 new engineering students per year, and there's like the state university, it has 20 spots, and if you're not in one of them, then you probably will get conscripted for the army. And the Russians had an advantage in this fact because after they finished school, they had 2 years where they could try to get into universities. Everyone else had just 1 year. So it actually gave them a bit of advantage there. But the ability to be able to pay to get into university was one of the biggest things that we asked, since everyone just mentions, especially from people who have Soviet nostalgia, that, oh, education was free. Yes, but they only took in, say, 15 new medics per year, and everyone else was forced to join the army because the amount of spaces allocated that if you got in university, you needed to go through a bunch of weird hoops. Because I remember that my grandma, who for multiple reasons, first of all being Jewish, secondly being married to a Lutheran priest in Soviet era, she literally had to get like maximum grades throughout her whole high school years and get like a very proper diploma where she literally had the maximum grades everywhere. Otherwise, she would never be allowed to go to college as well, which is another sad thing. And now, John, this is a kind of adding to this, Russian higher education is no longer compatible with European or American ones. They switched back to the Soviet model. They no longer have bachelor's, master's, and PhD. Right now, they have the same system that once you enter college, you study for 5 years, and that's your specialty. They no longer even like do these things. People are going to try. Of course, it's going to be done, but they currently blame the evil Western education system, which standardized these things like it's everywhere in the world. They blame this very fact for a bunch of issues with current Russia. So, yeah.
Well, I won't lie. The U.S. education system has its problems, of course, but it also has its standards. Europe actually does a little bit better on education than the U.S. does. But the bottom line is that, everybody concluded in the West what the standard would be, and it applies to everyone the same, right? Where it gets to be a problem is, going to university because you have to borrow a whole ton of money, you know, and things like
Bonus advice: come to Europe and study here, even if you have to pay. Basically, your whole education in Europe will cost less than one semester in the United States. Highly recommended. Not a joke.
true. It's certainly true. And I would pit US, universities against anyone else, but at the same time, it is expensive and you end up with crushing debt. And there's not a whole lot of help, available from the government for it. That's the problem here is that once you are out of high school, now high school, that's paid for. They're public high schools and everybody has to go to them. And the Army doesn't even contact you until you graduate, right? They give you tests to see if you're good. I got called by the US Navy for years after graduating, trying to get me to join. But
Well, your dad was a contractor, so they knew you personally, probably.
they did. And I also did very well on something called the ASVAB, which is a military suitability test of sorts that they give you in your final year of school to see if you're somebody they want. And apparently I scored really well for the US Navy. And that, yeah, God, they would call me every week saying, "You want to enlist? You want to enlist? You going to go to college or you want to enlist?"
Actually, that's one thing I'm going to talk about later because for this one, I'm recently just being asked by a bunch of people here in Latvia things, and I went outside and asked a lot of people whom I consider the most representative of default Latvian. And one thing that I'd like to talk about is more cultural later on. How a lot of people, at least here in Eastern Europe, that also includes Ukrainians, whom I asked too, their perception about life in the United States. When I told them about various actual problems that you have, they are way less well known that you might think. And this also forms their perception of the United States and what they expect from you and how they view things, which is a cultural perspective that I really would like to talk to you specifically because I know you like all this history and culture stuff as well. It's going to be very fascinating.
I do have the unique perspective of having lived in the Netherlands for a year, uh, shacked up with a chick.
Say hi to my admin, to my Discord admin, who's not here yet, but yeah, John here has lived for years in Netherlands as well, and he's Quebecois.
Just 1 year, and it was with a girl, a Dutch girl, and actually Dutch Polish. I should have married her, by the way.
Should have. Talking about marrying, I picked this one for you because as well. Russia calls for a register of single men who are not trying to start a family. Apparently, to a bunch of Russian Gosduma deputies, if a Russian man does not date a woman for 3 months, he should be blacklisted by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, given community service, or sent to the army. If there is no progress after 3 dates, then they will actually conscript you and send you to the front because obviously all this mess.
Well, obviously, they need to conscript Patriarch Kirill and the Russian Orthodox priests.
Again, without context, it seems funny, but Russian Orthodox Church actually just also released. Wasn't on the list. They just released a statement saying that the people have like stopped donating to them as much, and they call for more donations for their whole thing.
Well, like that's how that works.
My last piece of news, which is like two little things, which basically would concern me and you as people who make content, and this is probably going to be the most shocking for the younger people out there. Because apparently to Gen Z, I have hit the age where I'm considered old. 35 is now the new very old person. But two news. In Russia, people will be fined for searching for music, memes, and films on Instagram. There are currently almost 6,000 items on Extremist Register, and new ones are constantly being added. The register includes tracks by Oxymoron, which is a Russian rap music and everything. And now even looking that stuff up will be deemed evil. Then they went further, and just a piece of news after that was Russia will start fining people for searching for and even just reading extremist material. They intend to enforce this. Amendments have been introduced to the State Duma that would punish the deliberate search for prohibited content, such as videos, even through VPN. Previously, there were no penalties for just, looking that stuff up. It was just prohibited to advertise this. They want to fine people approximately $30 to $50, but do remember that the salaries in Russia, $700 per month is considered an okay thing in St. Petersburg. That's what Russian trolls get paid, and you can live a whole month there. In Moscow, prices are different, so these $30 to $50 matter much more. But see, the problem is that I'm also on that register. And you, as you have been on my show, you're probably on that as well. I find it weird because in Russia, they not only have the Ministry of Education, they have something that's called Ministry of Enlightenment. That's the best way how I can do this. It's осведомление. Basically, they have a specific ministry where you have to register if you want to make content like yours, John. It is now literally illegal for someone to do science content or political stuff on YouTube without registering with the state government. And those people who make the wrong content, if you literally would listen to this episode in Russia, then you can probably get fined for these $30 to $50. And I find actually that very, very scary. This is looking very dystopian.
Well, the prominent Russian YouTubers all left at the start of the war. They got out.
You'd be surprised. No. The problem is YouTube is really bad at enforcing this. Maxim Kalashnikov has been running his YouTube channel where he posts all his nonsense on YouTube constantly. He's not even demonetized. Russian Communist Party's official radio station runs through YouTube. Currently, they're on their 10th channel, but they operate. Even Yegor the utterly crazy, for some reason, they don't even enforce that properly. And one thing is that Russia tried to pull everyone out to RuTube, where basically they paid insane amounts of state money. But now these guys did their projects and everyone's back on YouTube because obviously no one watches Russian RuTube. It's just that it's very scary when governments start to do information control. I find that to be the most kind of heinous part.
It's very dangerous because that's when you know things are going south. When you start seeing the two things historically have been when you start seeing governments start categorizing people, which is what the Germans did with, the Holocaust, categorizing people and saying, oh, we have different types of what German means, right?
Kulaks in Soviet Union was the same thing too, just to add.
Same thing. Yeah, same thing with I'll tell you what, the 20th century was a mistake. It was not good. Ultimately, though, when you see governments start categorizing people, which they never should, that's a problem. And then when you see information control, that's basically propaganda. So when you have those two things together, that tells you something bad is about to happen. But in this case, it's weird because the thing that was about to happen that was bad already happened. It was the invasion of Ukraine. So what's it matter now, other than to dig up support? I guess.
See, the thing is, those people who make these laws inside there, they're kind of detached from points. And talking about war in Ukraine and also a subject that you know a lot about, Starlink. They basically are purchasing these terminals and everything and hacking them and such, and they're using that for everything. However, in one of these separatist republics, recently. The guy who runs Luhansk People's Republic, who, by the way, used to run a multi-level marketing scheme previously, and then he got involved in this stuff. He was basically cursed and yelled at since he decided that, wait a minute, people have too much internet access, so he literally banned Starlinks throughout this whole area. The problem is everyone in the Russian army also uses Starlinks and lives on them, which actively makes their own lives worse. They make laws that actively hurt their own war efforts as well because they don't think about it that much. Oh yeah, and Ellen Dussel over there in my chat here. Hi, and Ellen Dussel. See, John, you actually might well, we're gonna read through this comment later because this man is literally a rocket engineer, which is great. Yeah. Also, please join my Discord. We have a bunch of good people in comments here. But yeah, that's the scary part about information and all this mess when they control information, which is why a nice little segue to the main topic of today, which we're gonna move in and out of because I have a lot of things prepared. Which is why it was very interesting when you told me that Pentagon actually contacted you for this interview. They never contact people at all, and I found it strange that why would they? We spoke about why would they want to do this, and
I have to say that he was out of the Pentagon at that time. He retired out, and they contacted us and suggested, hey, an interview. But the reason for that is because I also had interviewed the former first director of Arrow, Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, and I was actually, I made a point to be reasonable and professional with the guy, and I think they just thought that this is a good forum for getting the message out. So I think that's what it was. Well, I have some ideas otherwise, but I can't get into
well, obviously. But what was the most kind of shocking and outrageous thing? And is there something that we can actually, one of this can be confirmed, I suppose, and what's the thing that caused most suspicion, and that was the most revealing important part of all this.
I think the most interesting thing that he said to me was that they do see anomalies that they can't explain, and one of those anomalies are the infamous black triangles, and they don't know what they are. And I believe we discussed, or I brought up that the British government also concluded that, and the best they could come up with is that it's weird temperature inversions, but that doesn't quite fit.
This is all the stuff that we know, which is confirmed because when we're talking about strange sightings, I looked this one up. Like United States Navy sees everything all the time, and we're talking about cases which have been documented, reported by multiple reliable sources. Those are not random person. These are not conspiracy theory nonsense. These are reportings by the army, which really, that's why they get investigated. I hope I got that one right. I tried to do some research before this.
Well, it was Congress. Congress ordered them to investigate it and release what they can publicly. And what they found was that there's things that they can't really figure out that are detected by military instruments. That's sort of the main thing, is a confirmation that yes, we do see stuff.
Basically, that we see stuff that we can't explain. Really, that's not just Chinese.
Yeah, we don't know what it is. You can't really do much more with that without a lot more data. So they are collecting data with something called the Gremlin, and the Gremlin is an instrument package that can be deployed, presumably even on a Navy ship or something like that. That is actually purposely designed to look at characteristics that these things are known to show. Certain radio frequencies, things like that. And that's essentially what we discussed, was that let's try to proactively resolve cases. However, the big concern with Arrow is getting leapfrogged by another nation state, China, typically, and with their drones and things like that, and balloons that go flying over the U.S., and identifying those. So they're going through a kind of a mission shift that the unidentified you can't identify unless you do, right? But they're trying to look at nation state stuff and figure out, what are these drones? Is this a foreign technology?
I can also advertise why you should go and check out John's channel, because I keep watching people who are academical military historians on also Blue Sky, who, because they get information about, say, these FPV drones from the few amounts of footage that they see from the videos available online, and they still have no idea how much this drone costs, which is much cheaper than they would expect. I have sadly seen people who think they know what a drone is, but they haven't really bothered to check, and this is why we need to know about these drones and such, because they matter. And China also follows all this mess, which is, I have seen people again making very wrong predictions about the future because they simply presume that a drone is kind of like the Reaper drone that flies around, and they just cannot imagine that a single thing that is literally an artillery shell of 155 millimeters alone costs $3,000, the cheapest version. For that, you can set up at least 4 of these FPV drones with explosives and everything. And I had to explain this because they also do very different things. So knowing what technology does and how this works, that's very interesting. But about drones, about China, I agree with you here because throughout all these FPV circles with drones here, which is something that I knew you'd bring up. Therefore, I spoke about this with the FPV community. The problem is that China is recently the biggest developer of drones, the kind of high watermark and the standard in the industry. You cannot even download their application, at least here in Europe. In my parts, it's no longer available on the App Store. You have to literally manually install the file there from their website. And there are a bunch of new rules for having your location as a pilot also being registered within the device. And they're doing a lot of stuff. And currently, we have an issue among the racing community and such, since they have now actually prohibited certain FPV drone components to be shipped currently. They have very strict conditions on what they ship abroad as well. Because China is focusing on this indeed, but those drones are much smaller, and an FPV drone, you can mistake an FPV drone for a large bird, like well, okay, not a large by Latvian standards. A really fat pigeon would be probably the size we're talking about here. Definitely not something that you could see from a Navy ship and spot it there. So just to add.
Also works vice versa because you can mistake a if you see, all right, so I'm right in the middle of the migration pattern of the Canada goose, North American goose. And if you see the bellies of those geese at night, and they operate at night sometimes with street lights, it looks like a black triangle UFO moving very rapidly across the sky, but that's only because they're, you know, I don't know, 20 meters in the air. They're close to you. So they look fast, but they're not. They're just going the speed of a goose. So it goes both ways. And that's one of the problems with UFO sightings is that, people often, when they see something they don't understand, they have a tendency to ascribe it to UFOs. But when you have instrument data like the US government has and the Russian government has it, and France, everybody has it, anomalous data from military instruments, then you've got a data set and you can try to figure out if there's something actually really weird going on. And that's essentially what that interview is.
Yeah, and I find it really, really weird because I think this conversation is now more normalized in the United States. Because again, I remember that I was really sad and was kind of disappointed since, at least over here in Latvia, where we spoke about Avi Loeb and this whole fact, and actually went to Latvian TV, which would be interested in this whole area. And it's still very much a taboo completely to even discuss this somehow on outside, like on the public media thing, because for us, our number one populist leader, populist politician, Mr. Einar Schlesers, he's gathered a bunch of these conspiracy crowds. So now, for some reason, such research is associated with our local version of Donald Trump, which is not considered to be very much kind of politically okay, which I find sad because, again, yet another way how we lag behind everything else. And this whole normalization that you can't even start talking about this, I'm not really sure how much people understand because I have read older books about this, and I also have like Soviet civil defense where they by the way, they state in one of the pages that if you see something weird like this, it's probably United States spy plane. Soviets very much speculated about these things, and currently I find it interesting that right now in modern day Latvia, it is considered more taboo to discuss these subjects in a serious way than it actually was in the Soviet Union, which I just find so strange.
Yeah, the Soviets were because I mean, people would UFO researchers back in the 1980s and 90s, before the fall of the Soviet Union, before 1991, they could go over there and they actually would be able to talk to the Soviet generals and things like that, and actually get information on truly unidentified phenomena. But the problem is that how do you know what's propaganda and what's not? In this case, and a famous case of this would be, not understanding something in Russia, would be the Dyatlov Pass case, where a bunch of people died of unknown causes under really weird circumstances. The speculation for years was that, maybe the Russians were testing some kind of directed energy weapon or something like that. But in reality, it turned out to be a certain specific type, or well, the best hypothesis now in modern times was that it turned out to be a very specific, weird type of avalanche, like snow avalanche, that basically hyperbarically destroyed these people and then created the effects that we're seeing. But even the Soviets had no idea, initially what that was. But the immediate reaction in the West was, oh, the Soviets were testing something on these people. But it turned out that we hadn't actually thought of the real reason that these people died. But the Soviets actually were open about that case.
I've understood how governments sometimes tend to not to think about things. Because currently, by the way, which I brought up to the politicians that I know and I have had contacts with, because there's a problem with how our laws work. Latvian diaspora growing means that our countryside here in Latvia gets underrepresented in the parliament. And I was stunned when I found out that, yeah, that's a problem that no one had actually talked about before, since it requires you reading 3 separate documents and then making logical conclusions. They also are just people, after all.
Well, that's the U.S. tried to solve that with what we call the Electoral College, which is very controversial. But they actually elect the president, and it's the whole idea of it is to apportion more power to rural areas, right? So that that's how it's supposed to work.
Well, yeah, but in our end, basically, it means like if the current trend continues, then basically how our system works is that their votes from diaspora, where they're actually, everyone who lives abroad is more patriotic of their own home country than people staying here. And their population is growing. Meanwhile, Latvia is shrinking, and their electoral activity is about 80%. Meanwhile, Latvia is 47%, and all of their votes get added to our capital. And the problem is that that system, how like you determine how many MPs you elect by the election activity of the previous election, which means that our countryside already is feeling that they have less spots representing them in our parliament than they should have according to the population through no fault of their own. And this trend increasing would be a bad thing. And I was stunned that when I brought this up to these politicians that I had spoken to, that no one had even thought about this before, because that's a Latvian problem. However, about the United States, because I want to move on that part, when I was thinking about this whole stuff, I sort of went from these Chinese drones technology, it's kind of like this Wikipedia research thing. But I would like to start out, because I will want to switch on to United States culture, and I will ask you about Roswell too at one point. But I would like to start with a good frenemy of my show, Igor Strelkov-Girkin, because he posted a very interesting thing. This is one of those few cases, because he writes about Igor Girkin on Trump's shift from peacemaking rhetoric to anti-Russian rhetoric. This is how he named his letter. And if I was Donald Trump, I would actually using this as a badge of honor to just, people on the left hate him, and this would be some sort of a thing which he could actually use as a thing of this letter. But he will never use that, because I don't know. He does. This is his opportunity to even find out about this, because the letter is not that long, but you as an American will also feel a bit happy and proud, because Igor Girkin really speaks about what the Vatniks think about the United States. And then we'll get to this part, because I also read Maxim Kalashnikov recently also broke down, and he calls himself a futurologist. So he also recently spoke about this UAP phenomenon. It's complex, but everything here is. So here's what Girkin wrote. Trump has said a lot of words that mask a single thought that has always existed and has been pursued regardless of what he has said before. This is in bold, by the way, and in all caps. The United States remains Russia's main enemy, standing behind Ukraine in a war against Russia. Bold ended. The United States has never been neutral or an honest broker, as our media has tried to portray it at the behest of the administration. The United States has been, is, and will continue to be Ukraine's main sponsor and will continue to help it. Another bold statement. It was only a matter of playing for time, giving the United States an opportunity to resolve the issue with Iran together with Israel. This was naturally followed by a new turn against the Russian Federation. Trump may have hoped to isolate Russia by pitting it against China and forcing it to make unilateral concessions to the United States. The idea was that China would completely cut off its support for Russia, leaving Russia isolated, after which it could be dealt with as desired. This part, by the way, is wrong because I spoke with people about that. I also spoke with people from the Chinese embassy who didn't want to be named, but I can tell you I now actually know why China is very careful with Russia. Interestingly enough. But continuing on, this did not happen, so the United States is once again switching to a policy of direct pressure and increased support for Ukraine, which will continue. They will provide weapons at their own expense and at the expense of the Europeans, and will exert pressure in every way possible until they achieve their goal. And the goal, I repeat, as Girkin says, is either to pit Russia against China or simply to knock Russia out of the game, depriving it of its status not even as a world power. Unfortunately, we have already lost that, but as a regional power. And another specific statement in bold, that is to disintegrate and possibly simply destroy it from within and without through joint efforts. There were no illusions. That was the case, that is the case, and that will always be the case. This is in bold again. We have wasted another year that we needed, and during which it was possible to defeat Ukraine in the hopes of the so-called American peacemaking. That's it. Peacemaking is over. The United States has once again shown its true colors, which in general it has never changed. It is only masked. So, John, as an American, I think that if Vatniks and hardcore supporters, if Igor Girkin, who started this whole mess, is writing such things, hey, if someone in the White House press corps is listening to this, because I know Langley definitely is, this is a good thing that you should actually send Trump, because this is no joke. This is a thing that he should be using for his PR, but he never probably will, because
I think he was trying to build a bridge, and it's Donald Trump. He's not very good at that. I think he was hoping to maybe find a peace deal. But the fact is that U.S. policy on Ukraine is Russia get out of Ukraine, and then everything returns to normal.
See, and this is the unexpected twist of this, because Maxim Kalashnikov, who, by the way, now calls himself not only a futurologist, but also a historian, so now he's offensive to us both. He also yesterday learned a new phrase. He finally found out what the perfect storm is. So in his latest 3 new episodes, 3 videos, he just keeps saying it all over. But he looked this one up, and as he's been always talking about industrialization of Russia, he has actually, which stunned me, he has actually tried to listen to your interview. Because apparently it can be Googleable in Russian. But as he doesn't speak English and used auto subs and made conclusions from this, he spoke on his Telegram channel. He also did not provide your link because he thinks that you are an enemy agent and working for the CIA, obviously. But he stated he somehow gathered from that interview that United States are now building these weapons and that you intend to weaponize Starlink and that you're way ahead of Russia and Russia needs to catch up on this. Because he somehow gathered that Navy is building those things that they don't understand. That is the level of decision making, and they basically at random stumble upon other channels, and this is the conclusion other Vatics came, and this was used as a comment, the fact that he commented that the United States is probably going to show support for Ukraine in these ways also, because he believes in biolabs too. And he states that from his personal sources, he stated that it's probable that the United States might send some of their newly created experimental weapons technology, such as these things that Navy has been building, to support Russia as well. I think he's finally broken down completely.
Yeah, it just sounds like conspiracy theory.
Yeah, but it comes from your channel, which I find just wow.
Well, what can I say? I mean, I'm out there publicly, but the bottom line is that it isn't that. Everyone reacted, and it's not just the U.S. It's Europe. Well, most of Europe, the Germans, Britain, France, everybody reacted to this because an invasion and an attempt at expansionism is what we don't want in the 21st century. That was the mistake of the 20th century, was keeping up this expansionist idealism, steal land, but with much worse weapons than we had ever seen before, right? World War One being a good example with chemical weapons and everything, that all these horrible things. There's still an area of France that's you can't go to because it's not cleaned up. from over 100 years ago. The world, and this was the whole idea behind the UN, which is pretty weakened at this point, was to try to solve problems between nations, but above all, get rid of the expansionism. The expansionism does not.
These days, territory doesn't matter that much. It's just that the big issue is that there's also been a lot of these interpretation things. Because first of all, interestingly enough, at one point, people in Kiev thought were getting nuked because a weird thing happened. I think it was 2023. I covered this on the episode. They also had a meteorite enter just like in Chelyabinsk, except there is no footage of it because in Ukraine all dash cams are banned. Literally, dash cams are banned due to how for military secrecy. And there was about an hour long situation where people literally thought it was some sort of a weird new missile. And now the local astronomers and people who study those sorts of things feel very sad because, unlike in Chelyabinsk, for that meteorite, we have no footage from Ukraine because dashcams are the only realistic way because they're always on and you can't really specify for this stuff. So now we know of an event that hasn't been documented because of this war, which is sad for science because this is a real impact for our research.
Of course, but well, I mean, in Ukraine's position, this falls to the wayside, doesn't matter. But isn't the whole idea of the Russian dash cams being so prevalent for insurance purposes, right? So for a car. And I mean, obviously, Ukraine being under attack, you have to be careful. Loose lips sink ships is what they used to say. Um, so you can't have footage of everything out there because you catch military operations. But Chelyabinsk, that obviously was, before all this. It was an amazing thing to see video after video after video from Russia. That video basically allowed them to go to the meteorite. They they actually they found it. There are chunks of it out there. And so, yeah, it is sort of sad because the more cameras you have, security cameras, dash cameras, things like that, which they're everywhere here, but nothing ever really falls here except small ones. It's Russia's gigantic landmass, Eurasia. The land mass is much more enormous than it is for North America. And so the chances of seeing a giant meteorite come in are higher, right? More land coverage. And Russia has cities, all the way from Vladivostok to St. Petersburg.
By the way, this is a note that probably United States people don't understand. Moscow is about the same size as New York and even more expensive, mind you. And Russia has more cities that are sized 1 million people or over than the United States has. It's really vastly spread out.
It would surprise you how depopulated the United States can be. My state is the size of Great Britain, and it has 6 million people. That's it.
When I tried to explain how large Latvia is to American audiences, I found out that, well, Wyoming is 15 times Latvia with half the population of Latvia. And I found a way how to explain this to Europeans as well. Latvia is the size of Netherlands and Belgium combined, but where over there you have, about 17 million people in Netherlands alone, Latvia has 2 million people in this whole area. It's like, imagine Belgium and Netherlands, except it's mostly forest. There's only about 2 million of us here, slightly less even.
Yeah, that's one of the least populous areas in Europe right now, right? What's left.
This is what happens when, we have been in the position that First World War, Second World War, all sorts of other conflicts all over the place. Oh, but let me get to the China part first quickly, because Chinese embassy in Riga is located right next to the old school which I used to study in, where we moved after that. It's very silly, but when we played football, soccer in our area, when the ball got thrown over the fence, someone actually tried to climb there, and they were, thankfully back then they didn't, shoot you for if you're 7 and 8 and climb into the Chinese embassy, then at least people were smart there enough. But I managed to get a person to talk to me off the record, and basically China's position right now, this was supposed to go in the news episode, but I'm just too busy to make another one as well. Their position is the fact that they don't believe that anything that's going to come after Putin is going to be ever as friendly to China as currently. Therefore, they don't want to over-invest, knowing that probably the next government over there, by definition, is going to be less sort of related. They have their own ideas, of course, and obviously other stuff that he told me was some things that I think that the other parts was propaganda material, but this part I took kind of seriously, which is why I find it interesting, because recently Russian government, to raise more money, wanted to release governmental bonds denominated in Chinese yuan, which is blocked by China. and so they have had a lot of their own issues, which is why I find it weird, especially since it comes to this China ordering everything around, because they are less friendly than you might think, and they also, China also trades everything to everyone. But about this very climate change issue, that also drives China, for example, to move towards Baikal and other places because they have strict regulations there. And then I read the EU documents and I found out that I happen to like Baltics, southern Finland, and bits of Sweden is like in this little circle, one of the few places in Earth. If you look at the predictions of how hard life is going to get, then we are Latvia is in the area which is going to be affected least by everything, unless Gulf Stream changes. But even then, I think it's mostly touches Finland because we're so isolated and down here. So I believe that, yeah, our population density is going to increase when people from the rest of Europe, where it gets too hot or too difficult to live in, or hey, from Florida, or who can't live there. I think that people in my country don't realize that in about 10, 20 years, Latvia might be just as well as populated as the Netherlands, and we're going to have to probably deal with the people from all over the place. So that's another interesting fact, because when I read these climate researchers, they managed to post the fact that they apparently felt politically bad about writing how short the list of horrible bad effects of climate change was, that they included the fact that it's going to get more forested because it's warmer climate, and forests are going to grow more, and that might cause troubles for farmers. The Latvian farmers really love the forest and everything, so that's really not seen as negative here. Our government right now is also, right now we're a small, tiny little country, but seeing this, I feel like we're gonna have to shift around. And when I see our governmental attempts to do these very same things and do some sort of research and stumble around these little things that they can't make, and especially since what Pentagon does and all this, makes me worried. Really, stuff is going to change, and for you, it's probably going to get more peaceful. For me, it's going to get interesting in the next 20 years. So yeah. But if any one of you listening wanted to buy some land in Latvia, this is the time to do it. It's cheaper.
I think governments, yeah, actual real people, the regular people, the rest of us, as I call it, don't think this way. It's just governments that do. I think, though, that with climate change, the big problem is going to be sea level rises. I mean, you get coastal cities.
And that is the weirdest thing, by the way. No, no, no. Baltic Sea, it has different issues. It is so isolated from the rest of the world's ocean. We have issues with the fact that near Baltic Sea anomaly and everything, it's getting like there is no oxygen there. It's getting to be this dead zone, like in the Black Sea over there. It's predicted that in our parts, like where I live, in these northern parts of the Baltic Sea, the sea level rise will be very much insignificant. It's going to be focusing elsewhere. They don't predict us to get flooded or anything.
That's right. The other thing is that the Baltic Sea, it might get colder than it already is. Now, the Baltic can preserve shipwrecks, like Swedish shipwrecks, perfect wooden ones from the Age of Sail, perfectly. They go down. I actually raised one back in the 60s at Vasa, and it's in Stockholm, and it was a perfectly preserved wooden warship from 1620s. The normal organisms, the worms that would normally eat the wood from those days, can't even live off the coast of Sweden in the northern Baltic because it's just simply too cold. Well, it's going to get colder, and that's interesting because what does that do to fishing patterns? Um, and other questions because like Poland has tons of fishing industry in the Baltic, and does it change the patterns? We've already seen with like Portugal, which their famous food is sardines. Well, they have to go up near England now to even catch them because they've migrated north because the temperatures of the oceans are no longer supporting them. So yeah, it's a weird time, very weird time.
It is. It is really because. But another thing is that currently we're so up north that I found it really strange when I found out that you can have multiple harvests per year in different southern countries, which is not possible here. And apparently that's going to be possible as well. So it's just a weird situation that you said 20th century is bad. This one's kind of also not very very good.
It'll be bad for a different reason than the 20th century was. The important thing is that you can't have the 20th century's politics, like expansionism and all that, going at the same time when you're trying to mitigate, the problems of the planet now. that are very pressing. But as long as everybody wants to go and wage war, that's going to distract you. It's going to distract everyone from actually solving the problems of this century.
That is exactly what I wanted to talk about, because I wanted to say the fact that I asked about these things, and I was surprised when I found out, for example, that my contacts in Ukraine, they are 100% convinced that literally everything that US Navy sees is actually United States spy tech. They want to believe in wonder weapons all this time and all these stereotypes and everything. And through Kalashnikov and Girkin and all this mess, that's how I got to asking myself, what are their conceptions and what really shocks these people? What are their stereotypes? Because I asked them for questions, because I know a bunch of them listen to the show for you. They mostly commented on things that they wanted to ask you as an American, because currently people just don't understand a lot of stuff, and the cultural things that people don't realize, and how their image works in their heads about the United States actually forms how they view United States media and attitude of average post-Soviet people towards Americans and Western people in general. And I was surprised, because I keep following these news. But the thing is, a lot of these people in Ukraine, also in Latvia and everywhere, what I presume is that they view our vacation hours, healthcare, and everything else as a given. They think that you make more money. Most of the people actually have no idea how much your healthcare costs. They have no idea that you have to go on a massive debt to do college. They just view the amount of money that you make, and they also think that you, obviously just like us, must have, like, a month of paid vacation per year, because that's obviously. And maternity leave, well, we don't know what sort of that is, but you must have a certain one, because people view that as, we have that thing here. They know you have some issues with this, but the level of depth is just weird. And in a lot of cases, I can tell you that this makes the average post-Soviet person think that you guys are way better off than you actually are, because they cannot. When I explained to for example, my aunt, whom I spoke with yesterday, she has lived in Netherlands for 10 years now. She's now back in Latvia fixing things up. When I explained and put it like comparison of average salary versus how much you spend for, say, healthcare, sometimes she was shocked and was confused about this. But what she was the most shocked about, which is really funny right now, is the Democratic candidate for New York, because all those things he promises, I have seen him being called a socialist all the time. Those programs he might as well have just stolen them from Latvia, because nothing of what he does would even be remotely considered socialism at all. And Latvian people are very much confused right now, because a lot of these people over here, again, through misconceptions, really really were more against Democrats, because they view news on modern day internet, and then they hear Americans use the term socialism, and then they automatically presume that that means the same thing everywhere. So they were shocked by the fact that, wait a minute, that's not socialism. No one's taken away your cow. So now there's a lot of questions specifically because of this mess, and the whole perspective about how wealthy and how powerful you are. They also have no idea that you work so hard as you do. Because over here in Europe, you work your 8-day shift, then you go home, and you are legally not required to pick up any, emails from out of work time at all. No one does that. Secondly, the very fact that you can't discuss your salary with other employees in the same company, yeah, that would be highly illegal over here. And I thought, I speak with you and people who listen to my show, and they're obviously more informed. But here, when I really just wanted to get some actual questions from people in Ukraine everywhere to ask you, this is where I understood that how weird these conceptions are. And I'm also sort of curious about, I don't know, how people maybe in the United States view us over here in Europe or something. It's just so bizarre.
It depends on the American you ask. If you've never been to Europe, you're not going to know what it's like. I have many times. To socialism, there is a difference between democratic socialism and the socialism that Marx and Engels were talking about in the 19th century. The U.S. still thinks in those terms of socialism as in Marx, Engels, and Leninism, right? Which obviously we call communism, but there are problems with that. So we're still on an older form of that, whereas Europe post World War II came up with democratic socialism, healthcare systems, national healthcare systems, and all that sort of thing. The U.S. doesn't have that because most people still to this day don't want it, because the insurance system, if you don't have insurance, yeah, it's going to cost, or you just say I can't pay, and they got to treat you anyway. But they're not going. You're not going to get great treatment. But at the same time, that seems to be what most people think, don't shoot the messenger, please, but most people think that it's actually cheaper to do it through the insurance system.
It's really not.
It's really not. And there's also questions because we're right next to Canada, which has an NHS, and they have waiting lists and, problems of their own that people bring up. And by the way, this all disappears at age 65 because then it becomes socialized medicine in the US. It's called Medicare. So the older people, if you make it that age, all of a sudden the government pays your bills. I always thought just
My brother has a question here in the chat because he has 3 children. I have yet to get even one, but my little brother has 3 kids, and an older half brother also has 3 kids. So I'm settled. I'm just making little extras in the future sometime. But he asked, "Do you have to pay for vaccines to vaccinate school kids in the United States?"
no.
I would like to mention this. I would like to mention a snarky comment that currently the guy responsible for health, Robert Kennedy, well, he personally thinks vaccines are useless and doesn't believe in them at all. And well, that was to the point where everyone else in the Kennedy family actively made a video stating that you probably shouldn't vote for this guy even. How bad it has to be when you run for such a high office and everyone else in your family says, please don't vote for this guy. He has nothing to do with our family. He just has the surname,
Ye
basically.
well, first of all, vaccinations, you literally go to the pharmacy and they give them to you. The COVID vaccine cost me nothing, and I had it 3 times. It's just the government paid for it.
Code is a bit different, though.
Well, it's also basically everything. Vaccinations are not really a problem because there's a lot of programs to get everyone vaccinated.
That's a public good, really.
The real problem is the conspiracy theory against getting vaccinated, which RFK is an example of that. That's the real problem is that people that don't take their kids to get vaccinated or they don't get vaccinated themselves, thinking that it causes, other health problems. That's a separate issue. That's people's choice, right?
Hey everyone! Annette here. Thanks for listening to another episode of The Eastern Border. This show is possible thanks to your support. So if you like what you hear, head over to patreon.com/The Eastern Border and help us keep it going. Even small contributions make a difference. And don't forget, there's also a Discord. If you want to join the community, chat with Kristaps, share memes, or just learn more about history, come hang out. You'll find the link in the show notes. Thanks again, and now, back to the episode.
There's a stereotype inside of Russia, especially about, oh, dumb Americans, all this stuff. You get stand-up comedians making jokes about Americans. And this misunderstanding has also caused this idea because what a lot of people in Europe don't understand is the fact that the sort of all sorts of energy, healings, and alternative medicines are so popular in the States, which, we mock here. Simply because it's so expensive to use real healthcare that, if you have no other option that you simply cannot afford to do the proper healthcare for the levels that you need, you're just going to try them out as a desperation measure. You have to include that as well.
It's more of a conspiracy theory measure because let's be honest about this. If you go buy a supplement, all right. Oh, I got the perfect one. This is milk thistle, which is actually an herbal medicine, right, for liver health. And it is actually a medication in the European Union. So it's there, but here you can buy it. This costs $25.
$25. Let me check. What's it called?
That's called milk thistle. But the thing is that actually costs more than my old person prescription medicine cost me because there are subsidies for it.
Yeah, all this stuff is weird because I thought back when I thought that, well, my grandmother was still alive. But we had an idea about how to handle financial stuff because the biggest things are things like insulin, apparently. I heard that was ridiculously expensive in the United States and it's super cheap here, but it's actually rare here. But regulations really differ since during my travels in the United States, I had actually a bunch of allergic reactions to a couple of your skin products, which shouldn't be legal here. But I do have to say that your food contains a lot of stuff that makes it like a burger in McDonald's does taste better in America than it does in Europe. A lot better. It's a different thing.
By the way, I have a theory about that. So I go to Europe and the local foods, all over Western Europe, were absolutely delicious. I mean, Italy has amazing food, you know, and obviously France, you know.
I had an Italian guest for 9 days over, so he spoke about this. Yeah.
No, the Italians win worldwide on food. Never found bad food there. You know, it was just amazing. And another thing is that water quality, just out of the tap in Italy, is way better than what we got here. You know, it's safe water. It was way better.
The difference is that over here in Latvia, in the Baltics at least, we literally sit on top of one of the largest aquifers on the planet Earth. It's called Russian platform basins. Like all of the Baltic, all of Latvia completely, 100% is sitting on an aquifer. We don't even mention water. I have helped some American people. I wrote recently an article about Belarus. I have helped some American people, deal with documentation here, who moved, people with families and everything. And they asked me, is everything all right? Because they came from California. And they asked me, but where is the thing where do we put the well and how long we dig this? It is physically impossible for us to where we put our wells is based on aesthetic choices, and you try to not put it on a hill so that you don't have to dig deeper. We physically cannot have all this mess.
No, not here. In my state, if you sink a well, you could hit sulfurous water. In other words, the water is undrinkable. So you have to have a well, it goes through that into a decent pure aquifer. And the aquifer here is called the St. Peter sandstone. You got to get to that. If you hit other aquifers, your water will smell like rotten eggs. You know, even though it's clean, it's just terrible. And it can get sedimentary. It's all bad. And, you know, when you're pulling river water and things like that, it's a completely different problem. So you have to chlorine the hell out of it. And that's not a problem in Italy. So because it's volcanic and you've got all these really, really nice aquifers that purify the water very, very much better than what the North America has, or at least this part, and California. California has less. So water availability is that. But the thing is, though, when I would go to American fast food restaurants in Europe, McDonald's or KFC or something like that, it did not taste as good as it does in the US. And my theory is differences in beef, because like traveling backpacking across Britain, for example, they were using British beef, and that's grass fed. It's different. You know, it tastes different.
Here we have dairy cows mostly, also, at least here in Latvia.
Right. Whereas we inherited all these English cows like the Black Angus and, Hereford and things like that. You know, it's different. It's just different meat. And same with the chicken, the different feed. But you will also find this in Japan. You know, look at a Japanese egg. You know, the yolk is almost like bright orange, and it's because of the feed, because they're feeding them bell peppers and things like that in their feed to make that. So it's different. So food globally is different, even basic foods like an egg.
Yeah, but I just thought about how powerful are these stereotypes of what we consider normal, really, and how we operate under those conditions, and how that changes everything. Since recently, one of my friends had a birthday, and over there were people who had traveled to Boston, basically, like, because that's one of the closest and cheapest places you can go to the United States and Europe. And well, as I have been a lot of times there and visited, a lot of people over here, going to the United States is a huge trip. So whenever they go first, that's their general impression about all this stuff. Because when I heard people making generalizations about the whole of the United States based on Boston alone, then I had to interject and say, to remind them that we United States is we view nation states here for the most part. We think that you're all sort of the same culture. What was the culture shock for me was the fact that a lot of people have no idea that there are movies besides Hollywood. State things work like literally states in Europe with their own internal laws, and they have, like, in movie theaters, you can see the big Hollywood movies, and then there are smaller ones which are made by state resources and all this stuff. It's very vastly different. Also, no one has any idea about what Utah is. Utah is basically a totally different culture on its own. Europeans like to make fun of Americans about that. Oh, they view Europe as a country. But once I've seen how Europeans view United States, it's actually the same thing, really, because the United States is also not a monolith entity. The cultures are vastly different, and in states like Texas, Texas is so big in its own that there are multiple climate zones over there, and they're like presuming that you can speak for the average Texan just because you've seen one is also just not a thing. But there are two complaints that we make about the United States, which I understood, by the way, because I'm learning to drive. I have a theory about the thing, because we were shocked by, when we were in Texas, how many people have dents in their cars, how trashy all this is, and also why you don't drive with the manual transmission. Because when people also don't understand how car-centric most of the United States are, so that as you physically, people don't, I know about the concept of food deserts. There are places where you can't get to the store without a car at all. So everyone has to drive. So if they would go with a manual stick, then people just wouldn't be able to drive, and that means you can't get food, right? And at the same time, people who probably don't even want to drive, who have no skills with that and no talent for this mess, they have to drive, which means everyone's forced to do it. And if you're forced to do it, there's going to be a lot more bad drivers. It's not like Americans are bad drivers. It's just that over here, the people who would be the same portion of bad drivers, they don't drive, they use public transportation. That's it. Which is a thing I haven't seen discussed before, really. That's my theory.
Depends on where in the U.S. you are. If you are in New York City, all you need is public transportation. There are many people that never have tried.
Well, okay, yeah, New York, Chicago, and some other places like that. But for example, vast amounts of America isn't that.
But this is changing in this age of things like, I don't know if you have it in Europe yet, but DoorDash, where they will deliver groceries, food, whatever.
Yes, we do.
So you have somebody else do the driving, which is what I do. I never drive because I have bad eyes.
Europe has a different issue here currently. Airbnbs are killing Europe.
Well, they're killing a lot of things here too. But the fact is that Europe got favored in a way because since all your cities are medieval and were designed from the start for walking, they're still compact, generally compact. Not the US, these cities are all relatively new compared to Europe, and they were designed for matter because everybody had automobiles by the time these cities got big.
One thing that I want to speak for Europeans is the fact that people view Los Angeles as it's the most viewed city very differently here, because I was shocked when I found out that the downtown part over there is about the size of Riga's Old Town. LA is basically world's largest town, and it's a suburban hell, which I find unlivable, but everyone's there. It's warm and nice. But people in Europe simply cannot comprehend the endless suburbia with boxes everywhere, with all this stuff.
That's urban sprawl, which is what we call it, and it's a result of the automobile, because all of those suburbs began after cars, whereas Europe didn't really work like that. But again, it's because we had a lot of land. Whereas typical European countries in the 20th century didn't. There's some big ones like France, but Texas is the size of France. So we had a lot more land, which led to that. But there were two things that sort of hobbled this. One, for whatever reason, U.S. politicians were almost universally, not every city, but they were really against public transport because they were lobbied by Ford or whatever to get rid of electric cars, which we could have had a lot earlier than we do now. But also they just wanted to get rid of streetcars, which is how they used to do public transport. So the public transport never developed. The other thing is our rail system is slow because you get expansion and steel tracks. So you can't, from heat. And so you can't actually have like a TGV like you would have in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, everywhere. You can't do that here because if you run a train at 250 miles per hour, it will derail depending on the time of day and the sunlight, so we just can't do certain things with this continent. So it developed differently. But as far as the differences between the states, bear in mind, you and Moscow are far closer than I am, where I was born, to Boston.
I have explained these things because when I put it into perspective, one of my trips was when I visited, because my good friend Joe Horgan, who is an expat who moved here, he's from Maine originally, and his father runs in Portland. I have been furthest up there. I've been to Bath and Portland up there, and his father runs a lobster thing. Interestingly enough, when I ate lobster there, people got angry at me in Latvia because that thing cost about 10 times more here than in Maine, which is obvious. But I went from Maine to down south to Washington, D.C. at one point. That's the difference between Tallinn and Warsaw.
Right.
That's an interesting thing here, John, since I have found out that at this point, currently, as much as I try to explain the Soviet Union to Westerners, a lot of local people, especially in Ukraine and everything, they view me as some sort of a weird transit to you guys as well. So whenever something happens and whenever Trump does something, I'm the one that is bombarded with questions a lot, and I have to answer these, which is why also I want to talk to you about this, because the misunderstandings are huge.
Take, for example, the state of Maine, where you've been. The whole northern section of that state speaks French. Nobody knows that, they because they're right next to Quebec. That is a whole band of French-speaking Americans right there. And then there's another one in Louisiana, which actually speaks two different dialects of French. The more famous ones are the Cajuns, but there are also the Creoles, of which I am one, that speak French still because they were French colonies, or the parts of Texas that speak German still. So if you look these things up, yeah, Americans are not so monolithic as Europeans think. And when I was living in the Netherlands, I had many arguments in bars, taverns with Dutch because they're the Dutch. They let they're opinionated and ask questions and things like that. It's very superficial. But the same problem, as you pointed out, is in America about Europeans. But at the same time, I think that was a product of the formation of the European Union, which looks a lot like the Union in North America.
Yeah, because it's really EU is slow and bureaucratic, and these whole, like, I remember that in Brexit there was some argument about banana curvature regulations. However, that is affected by the radiation amounts they have received or something, and the curvature was just the measurable thing. Also, another thing, which, by the way, I spoke. This comes from Evita's mom, by the way, about science. While I remember this, because I got a message that actually I have to speak about you. A lot of people don't understand how science actually is done. That's a big issue here. When you on your show mention, for example, traits of phosphine or some other gas or what the star is made of. See, the situation is so complex that they have no idea what a spectrometer and how you can measure these things via light. Like, I highly recommend that people do check this out again, because I've understood throughout my years as a journalist that it's not that you don't know something. It's fine. The fact that we live in the presumption that we do understand things that we actually don't, that causes the big issues.
Science is universal, so there's no difference between a Russian scientist and an American scientist. They work on the exact same principle. And in fact, the people that really developed spectroscopy, and especially with things like elements, was their specialty, were the Russians, especially metallurgy. The Russians were, well, Mendeleev and the periodic table, that's Russia. It seems like they want to create some kind of division in science between the Russian scientists and the American scientists, which is a Soviet sort of thing, but seems to actually be worse now.
It is. By the way, but Mendeleev, he got the Tsar's imperial medal awarded, but not for the periodic table. No one cared about that. It's just that he took one of the St. Petersburg nobles and spent 3 months doing scientific experiments to determine the fact that best vodka is 40% alcohol. He got massive awards for that.
Yes, there must have been quite an amount of drinking in Mendeleev's history, um, which one wonders if it was still not.
But about the whole science stuff, my wife's mom is one of the very few actually experts in her field. She works in private sector currently. She's an immunologist, one of the very few highly qualified people that they don't let her retire at the age of like, she's way getting close to 70, but she still works because simply there are not enough people doing this stuff. So she is uniquely qualified to talk about this, and scientists view each other as colleagues. Obviously, there are problems in the academia and internal politics as well. But the big issue here is that at least Russians now, people don't want to go there because, like, they still work with, for example, scientists in Belarus as well. In Belarus, the situation is a bit better, but it's really hard because it's really hard to progress your knowledge and share it if you know that the other guy has to report everything to FSB to make it political. And that is the major issue, by the fact that there are a lot of young people right now in Russia who have been forced to move abroad. And I spoke with Professor Igor Lipsitz. You probably checked out that show because he also moved away from his Moscow High School of Economics and everything. And through Putin's government, the big issue is that in their academia, dean, I think it's dean in English. I'm sorry, that's a term. Those guys in Russia are no longer picked for their academic achievement, really. They're basically now political process, at least in a bunch of faculties.
That's dangerous because it should be a meritocracy where the cream rises to the top, right? The very best get the best positions. I mean, that's a problem in the West too. But think about this: if you don't have that meritocracy, you put yourself at a disadvantage in technological development, right? The smartest people don't rise to the top where they need to be in the positions they need to be, which ultimately eventually compromises your national security. That's what they're going to accomplish. They're going to turn themselves back into the Soviets and be behind, but not so much as their conspiracy theorists say. The rest of the world is not magic here, right? We have to work within the law of physics.
It's actually Soviets, like actually real Soviets who have kept it is actually Belarus. Belarus is closer to Soviet Union currently than Russia is.
Yeah.
These misconceptions and miscommunication, I view it in my personal work since I finally reached out to the war fronts guys. And the problem is that I understood that, for example, that Igor Lipsitz person, he doesn't speak English. He's 75, but he's extremely well known here. However, he has basically no publications in English. You can't find him online in English. And my issue is that a lot of people who are over there who are hired to do this stuff, they presume that the whole of internet exists only in English language and look for things. Yesterday, there was a massive outrage on Blue Sky about how New York Times presented as uncritically a journalist who is like half German, half Russian, lives in Moscow. And check this. She was escorted by Ramzan Kadyrov's Ahmad troops, the guys who killed Politkovskaya, tried to kill me and everything. These guys escorted and ensured her safety to Kursk region to write about the whole war over there. Everyone here was just stunned, and I got a bunch of questions about all this mess, and Americans were shocked about this fact. But what I can tell you from deep personal experience, these blatant things, right? Even if they are Kremlin funded, might as well just be a mistake. But the blatant stuff is not what's doing the Kremlin's propaganda. The problems are newspapers that try to look more subtle and who manipulate information in important ways. That's the big issue here. And this is why I see, like, for example, the same war fronts, other channels, 90% of their work is academia, political science. They do good predictions. However, then they use as a reliable source something that needs some cultural context to understand what you need to look for, and that you actually even should be looking for something suspicious. And if you don't, then you take in false information, then you make errors. And I'm already laughing, but so far my predictions about how everything's going to go there, I beat Institute for Study of War massively. And the problem is that reaching out is the big issue, because it's not like I wouldn't want to help them. It's just that from here to reach out there, and I asked this to Evita's mom as well, because she also feels this, because that's the academia problem specifically, that Evita's mom, although is one of the most foremost experts here, she also doesn't speak English. She uses a translator. And the fact that still there are people out there, also in scientific fields, who view her as less knowledgeable just because she received her education during the Soviet era, this also exists. But she doesn't speak about it. She doesn't speak about it and ignores this stuff. But I asked her, how hard it is for me to reach your institutions, and she said, "Yeah, you guys are a little bit arrogant, more like this." But
no, that's true. First of all, I have to tell you about a Bulgarian I knew that came here.
Oh, go on.
He was actually a judo champion, like an Olympian for Bulgaria back in the 1980s, and unfortunately passed away. I loved the man; he was a great guy. But he said that back during those days, we didn't even get bananas unless it was from Cuba or something like that, but it was rare. And he's like, the government's excuse was it was capitalist fruit.
That's not a joke. Really? See, my biggest issue that I found that I use as an example to explain how far this misunderstanding goes and that it's really causing problems right now is the fact that I was asked once as a question, how much did pizza delivery cost in the Soviet Union? And if you're from here, that question is fractally wrong in all sorts of ways.
You remember the commercial back in the 1990s where they hired Gorbachev to eat a pizza in a commercial for like Pizza Hut, which is trying to open locations in Russia under Yeltsin? That actually happened. Gorbachev appeared in a pizza commercial. Didn't say anything.
I've seen that one. I have to say one thing, this for sure, like, people know Reagan's political jokes. I can assure you they are all actual very real political jokes. I have seen them personally in Russian version too. When you watch old videos with him telling these jokes, they are actually Soviet political jokes. He did not invent them at random.
No, I would
seriously.
I wouldn't doubt that.
My family, actually, because my grandpa from my mom's side, he literally waited to get a car. He waited 10 years in a line to get it, literally 10 years. And then the car was an old Lada, and that got sold to pay for funeral expenses. So
The weirdest thing about the end of the Cold War in the 1980s in the US is that we actually had easy access to a car from a communist country. It was called the Yugo, and it was from Yugoslavia, and it's well known as the worst car ever sold in the United States. But they didn't have any problem sending us huge numbers of Yugos. But that was Yugoslavia was sort of separate. They weren't that close to Russia. But yeah, that actually happened. That the United States was importing cars from a communist country, but their dictator Tito was not all that close to Russia. But we never saw real Russian cars. Those never came here.
Viesturs, my and Charlie's brother, he is an enthusiast. If you will ever visit Latvia, like my Italian listener just did, he was very much stunned by driving an old Lada and an old Oka car. You can get to drive those around.
Don't see them very much here, but the weird thing is, if you go to Cuba, it's still common to this day. They have cars from the United States back in the 1950s before Fidel Castro. They call them Yank tanks, and they're used usually as cabs, and they're like very jury rigged at this point with homemade parts and everything. But those still exist. And
I've seen this because Annette, my editor, hi Annette, she went to Cuba. She had pictures. She had been there, and she was also like posting all these. I remember the weird Cadillacs and everything.
it's weird because yeah, this is something that we've talked about up here because some of those cars that you see driving around in Havana are worth a fortune for restoration projects. Those, 50s and things that are worth a fortune.
You know what's the weirdest part for me? Due to the Soviet connection here, a person from Cuban ancestry gave me the Cuban malt drink, which is associated with Cuba in the United States. The thing is, we call that health drink over here to everyone. Latvian listening, yes, literally, that's veselības dzēriens, because the Soviet, they like that stuff. And they also have Soviet ice cream and everything, which is now associated with Cuba over there. The same way, by the way, that every American that visits Latvia instantly thinks that we have Mexican Coca-Cola. You guys will know, but for Europeans, in the United States, Coca-Cola actually does not have any real sugar in it. It's high fructose corn syrup, and it tastes different. So in Europe, we have what the United States calls Mexican Coca-Cola, which is also weird. But
Yeah, but we have Mexican Coca-Cola too. So it's a cottage industry within Coca-Cola that has developed itself. So if you want high fructose corn syrup Coca-Cola, you can get it, but right next to it is the so-called Mexican Coca-Cola in the glass bottle it's actually made with sugar. So we have it too, and it's all based on the idea that the real sugar is better. It tastes better, right? We all know that. But the thing is that you've got this group of people that are used to and grew up on the corn syrup, and they've got the people that remember it how it was. So Coca-Cola can sell you two different products. It's the same company manipulating prices.
remember, I had spoken with John for a while ago about his content is really good, but it's a lot of people also review the stuff, and I didn't find the time. But you sent me that one of those scripts, as I had an idea to maybe translate his stuff into English and just help spread this out. I got a question from a Ukrainian officer. He's a captain in the army there, and he likes all the science stuff. And he said that he's trying to learn English from you because they have to learn English now to move to do the studies and everything, especially the fighter pilots. I have now been actually asked to maybe translate your stuff into English with so that it would have English subs also down there. So think about this.
I don't mind. And if you need the scripts, I'm happy to send it. And because that's the thing is that if people want to use me to learn English, that's fine. But bear in mind, I do not speak it the same way that people in England or Australia do. If you want to learn American English, I'm pretty neutral. I don't have the weird accent. I just have the neutral.
The problem is that over here we get taught British English at schools, but then if you go online, then you obviously learn everything else. But yeah, John, I would like to ask you one thing though. I am ready to do this because I'll have a bit more time and it'll help my mental health. But you have to set up the YouTube channel, and then I'm just gonna add stuff to it, and it's gonna be just literally your text with everything left in place. I'm just gonna do a voiceover in Russian, and then you deal with the rest of the stuff.
I could probably do that.
The important part is that I wanted to say that I'm ready to do this because I have been literally asked to. Because again, for some reason, people, as you've been on my show, and people know that we talk. So people who don't speak English very well, that now they want to deliver questions to you. Let's talk about this because I also need some practice speaking Russian lately because I was only reading it because I've been stuck here. And with those of you who actually understand Russian, I was very nervous with Igor Lipsitz, and I noticed with my wife that Evita said that she's going to be talking to me in Russian for about a week before I even move somewhere. So it's going to be good practice for me to do that.
I actually YouTube is really useful for this because I watch channels trying to understand Korean, very different language. So I watch that content too. I'm not very good at languages, but I watch that content too because you if you have the subtitle and you know what's being said, you'll make sense of it. Movies used to work this way. I have a working understanding of German, right? And I did it by watching old 1970s German new wave movies. Also, well, French, but I partly grew up on French. Yeah, it's very helpful. It's probably the most helpful thing ever as far as learning language.
This is, by the way, why we in Latvia have these language skills, because there's so few of us that very little things except like children's cartoons get actually dubbed. Our default movie is with subtitles, and that's how I used to live. Like I used to say in the show, I learned English after watching the first Lord of the Rings movie, and then I literally sat down with a dictionary and the Two Towers and dragged myself through it. It was so interesting, and it took me half a year. But previously, my English wasn't actually that good. I wasn't interested. I didn't have any motivation to do that. I spoke Latvian and Russian. I was like, sixth grade or something. But then Lord of the Rings gave me the interest, and half a year with that and a lot of practice afterwards.
I'll bet that was kind of confusing because the Lord of the Rings movies, they use a lot of arcane terms that, terms that Tolkien made up, like an orc, and things like that we don't actually use in day to day.
But I'm a geek. I knew what orc was. Also, interestingly enough, for example, when you speak about space marines, a cultural thing is that everyone learns them here in English. Because if you would say space marine in Latvian, like I would say kosmosa jūras descendants, like if you say the very same terms in Latvian, they sound really silly. And the problem is that to us, English sounds cool, so all these terms are cool. But people don't understand that in English, for native speakers, they sound just as probably silly as they would sound in Latvian to us, which is a weird thing, which we barely ever think about.
That could be a thing. And, another thing that I noticed in Europe was I could not learn anything about Dutch in the Netherlands because all of the Dutch wanted to practice their English skills talking to me. And they're like, don't learn Dutch. And if you do want to learn it, go to Belgium, northern Belgium. But it was interesting. And that was 2001.
Dutch are like that. They're weird. I like them, but they're a bit weird. But they are basically what people also kind of don't get is that Netherlands is a big city.
I actually love them. Once you understand, culturally what's going on, Amsterdam is a really amazing city, really cool, and with really cool people. As long as you know the cultural rules.
As I was there just recently, I can assure you, I just spent weeks living near Rotterdam. First of all, also Netherlands is basically one ginormous city, all of it. And
It was so small, but it's the one that will get affected by the sea level rises because half of that land is below
underwater, literally.
the dikes, and they would flood that like in World War II. They're going to have to build much bigger dikes, which I'm sure they will, to reclaim that land, for farming. They really spent centuries.
Yeah, but the Dutch are so good at this that I was told that the Dutch are not worried about the sea; they're worried about the Germany's side. So,
Well, they always have been.
also about language, a comment here from my brother. In Latvian, we try to actually invent new Latvian words for things. Like the best one we've got, I think, is brand. Like our word for brand, listen, branding. Like the companies do have it. it's called Z-muls, which is a very Latvian word, and we invent those things because it's important for us. And I was surprised, to also my fellow listeners here, that in Estonia, they don't do that. Estonia doesn't have their own language center, so now the younger generation actually uses so much English in their language that they don't even, they have lost this connection, and that's also weird. The Americanization of many languages, well, it's not going to happen to French, but if we don't take care of our language, yeah, there's a real chance it'll die out because, diaspora kids most likely speak English or whatever, wherever they live. And the cultural prevalence of the United States is so huge that we had a support of Black Lives Matter here in Latvia, which has been good intentions, but it looked a bit silly, I have to say. So we have to worry about this part, which is something that you guys don't.
Well, actually, with English, there is no standardization, whereas with French, there is. The Académie Française. So they actually do issue new words for stuff from France for the Francophone speaking world, because if you don't do that, then you get dialectic drift, which they don't really like. They have it with like Breton and, those sorts of dialects. They try to suppress that, starting with Louis XIV.
France, by the way, is surprisingly very nationalistic in a sense. You have Irish American, whatever American. In France, they intentionally make it so that you cannot be anything else except just French. If you're in the Foreign Legion, it's called you don't get French citizenship. You have to become French to get it. Really, it's a very weird patriotic sense that they have. And another question related to this is also how the United States work. I have noticed that if you have had colonies before, or you are related to a colonial power, there's mentality differences between countries like us, which actually haven't gone and made an empire, and this imperial mindset still is prevalent in I think, bigger places who used to have this empire. You think about your country, you view your country slightly differently, I think. It's not much, but it's noticeable. Also, a thing which probably there is a difference between here, because we can feel this here between even Latvia and Lithuania, because Lithuania used to be this big duchy, and they care more about, like, we care about Latvian stuff, but Lithuanians, they focus more on the Baltic stuff because we're the only two Baltic nations. They are much more global in this sense that they view us as, and we wouldn't even agree, like if Commonwealth would get restored, I think people would not complain these days. We'd grab Estonia too, and Finland, you probably going to stick with Sweden, but you can join up too. Finland's cool as well.
But wasn't there also a Commonwealth, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as I recall, centuries ago?
Yeah, that is the Commonwealth. That is the Commonwealth that I speak of. Like my region, by the way, used to be a part of it, while other parts were parts of Sweden. The Commonwealth, by the way, interestingly enough, it was one of the most democratic countries out there, which also caused a downfall due to how insanely powerful the local nobility was. And when we're talking nobility, you think it's about 3% of the population. Meanwhile, like in Spain or in Commonwealth, if you fought a lot of wars, you had to have a lot of knights, and knights get obviously into nobility. So Szlachta, as they were called, they made up about 30% of the population at one point. Lesser nobility, and every last one of them had a veto right. Magical.
But there was a time where Poland specifically was really powerful. You remember what was it? There was a pretender Russian czar that when he died, they stuffed him in a cannon in Moscow and fired him back towards Poland. So that political area, and of course the influence of Sweden. But even before that, the Vikings through the Russian river system going to Afghanistan.
About the river system. I wanted to mention this because I literally wrote, because my wife is ethnically Polish from a Russian-speaking family in Belarus, which right now makes no sense, but this is the reason why I wrote this article, because a lot of people don't understand that Belarusian defining trait is the fact that they're closer to Baltics, and that river system is how Vikings got from north up there. They didn't go around Europe, they traveled through rivers, because it's so wet here that during spring, on one side there is Daugava, and then on the downside there is Dnieper, and to move between them, the physical amount that you would have to drag your boat is actually less than 1 kilometer because of all the streams you can take and swamps and everything, which is how amber got everywhere. The fact is that traveling through these forests towards Russia was much more difficult than using this water system, which is why if you look at Mongol Empire maps, you'll see that it ends literally here because we're a forested swamp, basically. And Lukashenko has done a lot to eliminate Belarusian culture to the point where American people, no one basically thinks that they're somehow separate. And, well, because of my wife's family, I wrote about this. And Belarus, sadly, is the way what happens when your culture gets sort of erased, really. So I highly recommend everyone, including yourself, John, go and check out my Substack. I'll send you the link about Belarus, because I spent a lot of effort researching the very aquifers and everything, because that's very pure and analytical work. I feel sad about those people who have joined my Substack without listening to the show just because of that, because that's way more history as a science than anything I've done here on this channel. But yeah, the very fact that currently people are surprised that Poland and Belarus, they have some relations. Meanwhile, their literally national identity, their national hero, the big guy of Belarus, is a guy who used to fight against the Russians in the Commonwealth. He was born in Poland, died in Lithuania, spoke all three languages. The thing is, he was also just a poet who wrote in Belarusian. And all these weird ties here are also very strong, but this is what Russia wants to destroy, because they see Commonwealth. Commonwealth was another center of power, which is against what Putin sees as glorious Russia and all this mess. And well, that's why this whole stuff happened. But again, interestingly enough, for some reason, while I was looking this one up, I really looked up with the Mormon things, because I looked up at the state of Deseret and the fact that they really wanted to secede from their own country. Yeah, I guess we know that Texas is very proud of that. They used to be a country for a while, but Vermont used to be that as well. It's just, it is so very weird that you guys have that, but in your states, in your regions, with these identities also, which you try to preserve in a way. And Quebec, of course, is its own thing. And some people got angry when I said that Poutine is Canadian. I was corrected, because Poutine is Quebecois.
Yeah, it's Quebecois. Yeah, and it's very good, actually. I like poutine. And I descend from the carpenter that was on the expedition from France to found Montreal.
What?
Yeah, later on in the 18th century, they came down south as France was colonizing the center of what's now the U.S. Britain had the east, France had the center, which is why I have a name that looks like it should be on a hockey jersey. Can I address questions that are showing up in the chat? Will that make sense for you?
Of course you can. But my whole point of this conversation, so that you know it's not just ranting, is the fact that we should really stop doing imperialism nonsense and unite to do proper science, because we have bigger problems to solve this century.
Well, the problem, to explain your question earlier about U.S. imperialism, the problem is we can't hold a colony because there is no legal structure in the U.S. to have a colony. You can have a territory, but it's kind of questionable because we have Puerto Rico and they can vote to leave, and that's what happened with Cuba and the Philippines. They voted to leave ultimately after we held them as colonies after a war we had with Spain in 1898. But we don't have the legal structure for colonies. People are citizens. You live in the U.S. or its territories. You are a U.S. citizen. Well, how can you ask somebody like the Puerto Ricans who aren't a state or a territory, oh, you can't vote in the presidential election unless you move to the mainland? Well, that's stupid, and we just don't have the legal structure. This country just doesn't have it. It expanded in a different way than the European powers like Russia did, where they were conquering territory, whereas the U.S. was conquering it in a certain way with the American Indians, but it was doing it in a completely different framework, a different mindset, and it was bad. We did some bad things, right? The Indian Wars and things.
I have a series that I want to return, because I started reading this book, which I'm showing him now. That's called Russian America, which is an account of actually Russian experiences colonizing Alaska. I need to get back to those things, because there are a lot of issues. The Russians were even worse with dealing with natives than you guys ever were. They were used to dealing with the Chukchi people and tribes in the Siberia, but the cultural differences over there from what they saw in Alaska was so bad that they want to claim Alaska back, but let me tell you a secret. They literally begged the United States to buy it, and the fact that they actually, got something for it which was in the form of written off loans. At that point, that was the best solution, because they had planted a flag, but they couldn't keep it in any way or form.
It's interesting because there still are old historic Russian Orthodox churches in Alaska still. Log churches with the onion domes, that characterize Russia. But nobody treated the Native Americans right. No one did. And we still struggle with that to this day. They have the reservations, but they have problems. And We don't do enough to help that. But the fact is that that was U.S. colonialism, was conquering this continent, right? But there isn't a legal reason or a legal way to claim a country that you've conquered, or else the U.S. would have claimed Iraq's oil or something like that. There isn't that. It's different with Europe because you can, according to the old rules. And I think Russia's still working on the old rules, the empire rules, but it isn't modern thinking, and as we said before, conquering land doesn't make sense. What makes sense is commerce, cooperation, science. Create a situation where we function somehow as a global culture, as far as problem solving and things like climate change. Do it that way, exchange ideas and work together and all this.
Which is why such conversations that we're having are actually very productive, because I have spotted these issues that miscommunication causes a lot of problems. Because, for example, people were complaining, my fellow Western journalists, that they got less access in Ukraine. Well, but because Ukrainians, when they notice that Western sources make mistakes and use those same errors that I keep mentioning, they lose trust, and they kind of sometimes operation security happens and misunderstanding causes real trouble. And if we want to expand to the stars, as we should, we don't have to become a single country. We just have to learn to work together properly. That's all.
No, yeah, cooperation. You don't have to become a single country. What you really need is for everybody to get on the same page with liberal democracy. Liberal democracies do not go to war with each other. Look at Europe, where you once had Britain and France at each other's throats for centuries. They fixed it, and it was through democratic action, because the people gain a greater say than what they had, under a duke or something like that. So if you can create a situation of liberal democracies, which all of Europe is that.
I'm, by the way, writing an article of this because I found out that people compare Putin to Hitler all the time, right? But Hitler's Nazi Germany is associated with efficiency and all this stuff. But now that I've done some research and thought about this, actually it was closer to Putin's Russia than you might think. They also had so many problems with running things.
I would honestly liken Putin not to Hitler, but to a czar.
There is one little subject that I have wanted to talk about, because I looked at children's cartoons, not because of my little brother, but because of some relatives of Evita. And I looked at how little cartoons for kids look these days. And then I Googled up, because you can find documentation about how industrial they have turned the production of those things. So currently, cartoons are not about telling a story like for these toddlers. They're basically dopamine drugs for kids. Check this out. They have a comedy that basically takes a child, puts them in front of a TV, and puts a distractor behind some music or something else. And then they show him an episode of this cartoon with flashing lights, changing colors, and 5 super short cuts. And then they meticulously measure exactly in which second and how many times the kid looked away. And then they improve this until the kid cannot just look away from this, which is why you have this phenomenon that if you just give iPad to your kids, to 3-year-olds, to them it works kind of like basically drugs. They're not trying to tell a message, they're just trying to keep them addicted to this stuff. And I think people should really pay more attention to this, because you guys have kids and that really negatively impacts children's education and development.
I can tell you this from experience. So in the US, and this is a problem here, obviously, it's essentially the equivalent of clickbait. They just entertain the child, and again, as you said, keep them addicted. When I grew up in the 1980s, it was educational, right? So you had this giant, you had a guy in a bird costume, a big bird, teaching you Spanish words, for example, because we're right next to Mexico, right?
Every little cartoon, it got funded by the state, because literally everything had to be educational and teach kids something. Teamwork about something. It all was technically education all the time.
It was, and that's what you were trying to do, because we call it. It still exists, but it's not what it used to be. We call it the public broadcasting system. It's like the BBC for the US. It's funded by the government. Their idea back then was to make content that was educational, taught the kids something, right? But when you have all these private, companies and content creators and everything else making whatever content they want, it becomes very vapid, very mindless. And the education is not there now that what's once was there. Now, if you know where to look, you can find it, this type of stuff, but yeah, it is not the same world. And I worry about that because back in the 80s during the Cold War, I would watch PBS and see my cartoons and educational shows and all that. And then at 5 o'clock in the afternoon would come on the news stuff. And that's what taught me, in the 1980s, what the Soviet Union was, who Gorbachev was, actually Brezhnev, to be honest with you. That really dates me. But yeah, I would watch the news shows at 6, 7 years old after the cartoons, and that led me to be interested in international affairs. I don't know that that happens in the same way today. I don't think it does. I think it's defined by the internet, and that may not be as high a quality as what we used to have.
No, of course, there is lots of good stuff out there, and people are trying. And I can talk about this because, again, when Flow won the Best Animated Movie, the producer guy, Matti Skaj, he's the son of a journalist that's a friend of mine that's also been on the show often. So I have a personal connection to that movie, and that's a really great animation. And there's a lot of good things out there. I just looked this up. Like, if you want to find it out yourselves, look up Coco Melon. Coco Melon Nursery Rhymes on YouTube. It has 195 million subscribers, and that is super popular and has been responsible for cases where kids simply cannot go away. And I didn't know how to speak about this, but the same situation is happening in a lot of cases with AI. Instead of producing something that is good, they produce something that's focused on all of this stuff, which is also why, for example, mobile games used to be actually decent back in 2013, but now they're just everything needs to be super monetized and everything. And well, I have hope that channels like mine and John's, where we're actually there, real people, really talking and trying to do actual good things, we can't beat corporations, but we can try to be the best that we can be. And I hope at least that you guys here, and John, you as well, trying to not get lost and not get super commercialized and everything. This really sort of is important. But now, John, what was the question you wanted to check out over there?
Let's just look at the chat questions and answer them. And
They had a bunch of commentary. Oh, here is one by Joe. Joe Luxemburger Spy. This is the only person with a Luxembourg citizenship that I know. He lives in America, but we call him the Luxemburger Spy. But I can read this one. John Michael Godier. So Joe writes, sorry if it was asked before, but in your episode with the leader of Arrow, question mark, he didn't understand this. The guy said observations of alien tech by government contractors were accurate even if they were distorted through the lens of sci-fi or fiction. Which observations was he referring to? Just the lights in the skies or the reports of advanced tech in Area 51?
I was not able to get that out of them. They won't tell me, but I did notice that as well. In that it seemed a half answer to me. Ultimately, they went in and they would look at these programs and they were like, yeah, some of the stuff actually happened. Some of this existed, but they were misinterpreting it. Well, believe what you like, because yeah, the pop culture got a hold of a lot of that stuff, like Roswell. Maybe something happened. Maybe it was misinterpreted. We don't know, but it was 1947. So what do we know now? Everybody's dead that actually witnessed it.
I'm pretty sure that we have human tech, which is just very weird, that exists in a one-off exemplar. Like, I have seen pictures, for example, for a completely round Soviet experimental tank that literally looked like a big ball with on treads and everything. And well, we know when it's made. It's totally human, but no one knows which factory, why, how, and only one has ever been seen. We have problems with sourcing human stuff already. So if something would plop in like one of those von Neumann probes, I hope I pronounced it correctly, then how would we even deal with this stuff?
Well, firstly, about secret tech, the U.S. would, first tried to develop a flying wing in the late 1940s. Jack Northrop, that was his dream, and his company is now Northrop Grumman. Well, it took them 50 years of secrecy to get to the flying wing, the B-2 bomber, stealth bomber. So they keep it secret because they want to keep it in their pocket for the future when they can develop it. So a lot of things that were tested didn't get made into anything, but they remain secret because maybe someday they will be useful. So there's all kinds of stuff like that, and all countries, the Russians do this, Germans do it. There are reasons to keep things secret because you think you have a seed technology that might lead to something later. But when people see that, it's so different from anything they've ever seen that they misinterpret it. They say, "I don't know what that was," or they build on that and say, that must have been aliens." So there's that aspect.
About secret tech, there is a little thing which we were taught in university that I really want to talk to people about. People imagine some sort of, as a secret tech, often they imagine some sort of wonder weapon that can decide a war instantly. Well, those things aren't secret tech. Secret tech are some spy plane with tiny little technological details that give you a slight advantage. The problem with super weapons, such as nuclear weapons, why do they work as a deterrent? Because everyone knows that you have them. A super weapon that can destroy everything doesn't work in your goals of your military if you don't tell anyone about them. That's the whole issue.
And that's why the most powerful weapons we have are the nuclear weapons, the nuclear arsenals. And everybody knew about them really quickly because we used them against Japan. Well, everybody knew, and so
The worst part is now they use the term tactical nuclear weapons, but what people don't understand is that by today's standards, those weapons, those nukes dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki would be tactical nuclear weapons. That is what a tactical nuclear weapon is by modern day standards.
yeah, they would be. And much bigger came with the hydrogen bombs. The Russian Tsar Bomba being famous as a 50 megaton blast, but the Russians could have pushed that up to 100. They were just worried. They never did it because they were worried about the effects of it.
They, by the way, tested them. Zhukov did this slightly after Stalin's death when there was this power struggle thing. One thing that wasn't in all the Stalin's death movie was the fact that they still had a bunch of people from gulags put together to serve as troops. After one of their nuclear tests, they literally sent in those penal battalion troops to emulate and check how an offensive in the irradiated area would also look like. There's a bunch of documentation being uncovered now that when you understand that, if you look at documentation and find out that there's like troop movements through an area on documentation at the same times when this happened, it was obviously top secret, but I know people who research this stuff and they say that, look, we can't prove that they intentionally did this or that they nuked people, but we definitely can say that, yeah, basically after a nuclear test, Zhukov, without explanation of anything and radiation is hard, marched in a bunch of those penal battalion people who, were still around because still existed.
Yeah, but the U.S. stuff like that too. I mean, they would, release radiation off the top of buildings and test it on their own population. The Cold War, again, 20th century was a mistake because the Cold War really, mistreated a whole lot of people globally. That isn't really talked about well, or how about, well, I guess the most famous example would be people trying to go from East Germany to West Germany or Berlin and getting shot just by, just by trying to cross one city.
But there's like a lot of things. For example, a lot of people just don't understand, like, and that's our job to communicate all this mess. And like you said, we have global problems to solve, and everyone wants to solve these issues. But the fact is that we are way more similar than we might think in a lot of ways that we don't expect. Yet I've noticed that it's the obvious ways that we think that we are way more similar to each other that actually has errors, because all the mistakes start from the moment when we presume that we are the norm and everything is here, and that's to the mundane things. For example, also the fact that the United States is so much more south in comparison to us, that you guys take showers way more often than we do here. But that's because we're up north, it's colder here, and you guys drink more water and do this stuff. Where comes the stereotype that you waste water and we're all dirty? Just because Mercator map projection makes it look like we're super kind of similar there.
I have not heard that stereotype. I can remember one that French women don't shave their armpits, but that's we live in a very different world now.
Soviet women also didn't used to do that simply because there was like women started caring about this stuff in the late 90s. Like my mom's generation, our parents' generation who lived through Soviet era, they consider it to be like, oh, that's popular among the young girls.
Well, but that's grooming stuff, but I never heard anything about Eastern Europeans or anything like that.
And we had a nice little tangent, which I hope that I didn't want to spoil your interview, and I tried to push it in more alien direction, but it went where it went. But I'm still happy because I really I can't put this on my normal episodes, but this communication stuff causes me problems when I have to explain bad sources to people who don't listen to me. And then people ask me about John's channel, and then we're here. And well, I think we did a public service here today, John. I'm really thankful for this.
Probably so, but I want to address something from the chat. Joe, Luxembourger spy. Yes, the U.S. did this, and not only it did in two incidences. There was one where they released radiation from buildings in St. Louis, which St. Louis is right there, and tested that on a population. But they also actually exempted the state of Nevada, where the nuclear testing was going on, rules on fallout. So they would test their nukes, and it was falling on ranchers, and they didn't do anything, and they got caught and sued and all that stuff. But yeah, that was a black mark from the Cold War on the U.S. was nuclear testing, because they were so desperate to stay ahead of the Soviets that they would actually sacrifice U.S. citizens' health. But they didn't also know that terrible things would happen, like cancer, and everything else that comes from that. But yeah, that did happen, and that's a black mark on the U.S. government.
Well, that's the whole thing. There's normally this tendency where, like over here in Latvia, some people complain about Latvia because they have a distant relative that lives in California, and then you always tell the good stuff to people. And meanwhile, if it is countryside like home in Riga, they had a Latvian family from California arriving here. They also were very happy about our road signs and everything. We need to communicate more and act like a proper humanity and deal with a bunch of things. And I'm happy that we can do this, John. And you'd be surprised how many people have asked me how do I know you and everything, because a bunch of people who didn't even know that I had a show. When I went on to your show that time, I was stunned by how many people in Latvian scientific community were just confused. Because again, I'm not popular in Latvia at all, so I'm confused about this stuff. But you're also way more listened outside of the English-speaking world than you might think. That's because you say "live" at the end. Evid is trying to replicate that.
One of the biggest spikes that my original channel had early on was because a Lithuanian television station picked it up and translated it. I understand that, but I like it because I like the international flavor and, global thinking.
Of course they would do that. Remember that our national television is kind of like your state television. What does state televisions cover? Those things.
Yeah.
I would love to talk longer. We've been at this for 2.5 hours. John, you will be back on my show at some point, because this is really, I think this is useful explaining this stuff.
Anytime you want, Chris. We're buddies and have been for quite a while now.
By the way, if any one of you listening to this right now want to also join into this stuff, it's because also Ross also came in and we spoke about the technical parts of this. But if you want to join these conversations, yeah, this is what we do in our Discord, which is, well, usual Discords are full with 13-year-olds. Maybe over here we're my age and above, and it's a decent Discord channel, as you can see, with very friendly people. And there's going to be a link to it in the show notes, because this is the stuff that I keep open. For example, when I do my research things, and I also think that I should really focus more on maybe doing things live on Discord, even when I'm researching, because I can't stream video games, and that's the thing these days, and I don't want to do that. I want to do my thing. До свидания, товарищи. Happiness is mandatory after all.
Thank you for listening to the Eastern Border Show. If you have any questions or comments, go to our website, theeasternborder.lv, and leave a comment there. Or email us at theeasternborder@gmail.com. We'll be sure to answer. You can also follow us on social media and contact us there. If you enjoyed this episode, then leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends about us. It really helps us grow the show. And remember, happiness is mandatory.